There are places for our dead, places of peace and not dread, sites of simple or elaborate stones that memorialize our lost ones' bones. Welcome to Stones and Bones. Whoa, welcome to Stones and Bones. Whoa.
Hi, I'm your host, Diane.
And this is Kelly.
This is Stones and Bones, Episode 1, Burying the Dead.
One of the more difficult tasks that humans have to face since the dawn of our era on this dusty little planet is what to do with our dead. Various cultures have worked out a variety of ways to accomplish this task. There are cave burials, fiery boat launches, cliffside burials, canopy burials, burials at sea, above-ground crypts, traditional in-ground burials, and the list goes on. On this inaugural episode of Stones and Bones, we are going to discuss these methods and the history of burial grounds.
The Greeks were the ones who coined the term cemetery. The words cemetery, graveyard, churchyard, and burial ground tend to be used interchangeably, but there are actually official differences. Churchyards and graveyards are connected to churches, while cemeteries are anywhere not connected to a church. Burial grounds can be any place where people are buried, including places like caves, the sea, fields, cliffsides, etc. As a matter of official record, the oldest cemetery dates to the Paleolithic period and is found in Morocco. This is the Tafaral Cave and has at least 34 people buried within it who could have been placed there around 14,000 years ago. This group of people have been named Ibero-Maurasian, and they lived in the area of Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia.
Around 11,000 years ago, sky burials, or jator, became a funeral practice. These are still a part of Buddhist tradition today, particularly in Tibet. A sky burial was thought to keep a soul from being trapped in the material world. A deceased person would be placed in a seated position while prayers were offered and other rituals were conducted. The body would then be taken to a high place where carrion-eating birds could be attracted. The body is laid out, and loved ones and monks sit and watch while vultures come and consume the body, and whatever is left is either buried or burned. The quicker the body is consumed, the more of a good life the deceased must have lived.
I'm going to put ketchup all over my dead body and do this. Then I'll get consumed really fast.
Well, if you led a good life and you were fat and happy, there's
You
a
know
lot of
what?
marbling on that meat.
I was going to say, that shows that you lived a good life. You got a lot of marbling on that. I'm going to be like a big fat ribeye.
We are so disrespectful.
Around 5,000 years ago, Egyptians built pyramids for their dead. These were generally built for pharaohs, with the first one being Pharaoh Dosir. The last pyramid was built around 3,500 years ago, and then rulers were buried in underground tombs like in the Valley of the Kings, which we covered in episode 43. Large mounds of earth are found all over the world, and many were used as burial chambers in ancient times, with quite a few finding themselves ransacked by grave robbers. Grave fields were the predominant burial grounds during the Bronze Age, and based on custom, could be flat graves, which were rectangular pits, ossuaries, which were chest boxes, shaft tombs, which were rectangular burial structures mostly found in Greece and China, with the best-known one from the Shang dynasty for Lady Fu Hao. Tumulus fields, which are large burial mounds, and urn fields, which were urns that were filled with ashes and then buried in fields. So basically, grave fields were the most predominant type thing that we have out there, and they span centuries.
In the 7th century, burials were turned over to the church, and people could only be buried in consecrated ground. Most bodies were placed in mass graves to decompose, and then they were dug up and placed in ossuaries, and then placed in churches under floors or behind walls. That was for the common man. Rich or prominent people would get individual crypts in a church that usually had their name and dates and sometimes their coat of arms. Vikings were Scandinavian seafarers from Sweden, Denmark, and Norway, and came onto the scene around the end of the 8th century in 790 AD, when they attacked the English. Their society lasted until around 1100 AD. Vikings sent their dead off with fire. Sometimes the body was placed in a small wooden boat and launched after being set ablaze. But more often, a body was burned on a pyre and then put in a burial mound called a tumuli. The Vikings believed that the hotter the flames and the higher the smoke, the closer their dead would get to Valhalla, their version of paradise. A great warrior would get honored by being buried in their longship.
Can you imagine digging down as an archaeologist and then you find a big ship that's underneath the ground, just buried?
Not really.
And then there's one skeleton in it. And speaking of being burned in a boat on top of the water, how about burials at sea? These have taken place since man launched their first boat. Many different religions recognize burials at sea and have special rites and prayers for the practice. As a matter of fact, water burial is the primary form of deposition of remains for Hinduism. Bodies are usually cremated and then the ashes are immersed in a sacred river. For other religions, the bodies are wrapped in canvas or a body bag of some sort and weighted before being lowered into the water. And it is possible to be buried underwater at the Neptune Memorial Reef, which is an underwater columbarium.
For many indigenous tribes, burial in the earth is taboo. One such group lives on one of the Indonesian islands. These are the Toraja people, who are known as the people of the uplands. They hold very elaborate funerary rites and believe that it's sacrilegious to bury someone in the Earth Mother. Only birth is to come from her, so death shouldn't be a part of her. They bury their dead in hollowed-out caves, high up on cliff walls. The more rank someone has in the tribe, the higher they are buried. The body is left out in the open in the cave to decay. An effigy known as a tau tau is placed at the cave entrance to indicate that the cave is a grave and to protect the spirit of the dead person. If a cave can't be found or made, a coffin will be hung from the cliff wall.
In North America, Native Americans buried many of their dead in mounds. These eventually would be robbed of their artifacts and bones over the next couple hundred of years. One of the earliest ones to suffer this fate was the Grave Creek Mound in West Virginia, which had belonged to the Adena civilization. The Surgeon General's office had issued a memorandum in 1868 to Army field surgeons directing them to collect Native American remains, particularly skulls. Isn't that fabulous?
Oh my word.
Indian burial grounds weren't treated with respect because white settlers believed them to be lesser than. Other tribes used caves and some built scaffolds to place the bodies above the ground. And there were others that just buried loved ones in the ground. Most bodies were wrapped in blankets or some kind of shroud and buried with items that were sacred and important to them. For example, the Comanche wrapped their dead in blankets and placed them on a horse behind a rider tasked with the job of finding a cave to bury the body within.
Churchyards were used for years, but as time went on, these smaller burial grounds filled up with coffins 5 and 6 deep. And most churches were near the center of town, and people realized this was unhealthy to have all these dead bodies so close to town. There was also a need for mass burial graves during epidemics. Towns and villages started moving cemeteries outside the city limits, and they became larger plots of land. Burials for early settlers in America started out the way that they were in Europe, with small plots on family-owned land. Next, churchyards were designed. By the early 1800s, the same issues that were experienced in Europe were realized here, with burial grounds being too close to the main population. And with plagues and other epidemics, it was decided burials needed to be moved to rural spaces.
This would be called the rural cemetery movement. Grove Street Cemetery in New Haven, Connecticut was originally called the New Burying Ground when it was founded after the 1794 yellow fever epidemic. This type of burial reform brought with it delineation between social classes, religious practices, and race. There was no more haphazard burial of people, and there was more effort to upkeep burial sites. Landscape architects would design these graveyards into parks with winding roads, large trees, water features, and immaculate landscaping. Beautiful sculptures and grand memorials and mausoleums were built. These cemeteries were basically public parks, and families would use them for recreating and picnicking.
Early settlers founded New Haven in 1638, and their first burial ground was between the main church and the market area on the town's green. This was called New Haven Green. 20 years later, the churchyard had around 50 burials and was already serving the community in a way that rural burial grounds would. The green became too crowded, so U.S. Senator James Hillhouse gathered a group of citizens in 1796 and they planned a new cemetery to be placed on the edge of town. This was founded in 1797 as the new burying ground, with the first burial on November 9, 1797. This was the first cemetery in America to be arranged in family lots. The cemetery was divided into separate areas for the 3 churches in the town, for poor people, people of color, people who didn't live in New Haven, and members of Yale College. The president of Yale, Timothy Dwight, would bring people around the cemetery for tours, and he wrote in 1811, "I have accompanied to it many foreigners, and many Americans who have traveled extensively on the eastern continent, none of whom had ever seen or heard of anything of a similar nature. An exquisite taste for propriety is discovered in everything belonging to it. No plot of ground within my knowledge is equally solemn and impressive."
And now a little break for a word about one of our sponsors. In 1845, a new entrance was designed by architect Henry Austin, and this was in the Egyptian style. The name officially changed to the Grove Street Cemetery in the 1870s. A chapel was added right behind the gate in 1872 and features a gilded bee under the eave. And apparently this is because bees helped shepherd the dead into the afterlife. New Haven is known as the Elm City because Senator Hillhouse loved trees, and so the cemetery was filled with trees. Many early trees were poplars, but they didn't hold up well. Evergreens became the predominant trees. The cemetery reflected the city not only in tree types, but it had the same geometrical pattern of New Haven's 9-square layout. The paths were made easy to navigate for carriages, and more elaborate memorials were erected. This truly was the initiation into the rule of garden cemeteries that would soon be coming. So this one isn't considered like the first one, but it's the precursor. We're getting ready to have them.
There were many noteworthy people buried here as well. Civil War veterans that included people of color are here. A Black woman named Mary A. Goodman gave her life savings to Yale Divinity School for Black clergy education. There is Dr. Worthington Hooker, who was the father of American medical ethics, but he wasn't the only father of something. Also buried here is the father of American geography, Jedediah Morse, and the father of American football, Walter Camp. Lars Onsager was a Nobel Prize winner, and Eli Whitney, who invented the cotton gin, is here. There is only one person in history whom signed all 4 basic documents of American sovereignty, the Articles of Association in 1774, the Declaration of Independence in 1776, the Articles of Confederation in 1781, and the Constitution of the United States in 1787, and that person was Roger Sherman. He is buried here. And Roger Sherman Baldwin, who argued the case for the Amistad slaves that were imprisoned in New Haven, has his final resting place at Grove Street Cemetery.
Obelisks, large statuary, and pyramids became very popular in garden cemeteries. So much so that Nehemiah Cleveland wrote in his 1847 book, Greenwood Illustrated, "We've seen a ground so full of pyramids and obelisks that one could almost fancy it a gigantic cabinet of minerals, being all crystals set on end." Isn't that a neat way to describe it?
It is. I love that.
Over time, the use of elaborate memorials fell out of favor, and there was a need to make upkeep easier. So many cemeteries now won't allow anything but flat headstones and limit any kind of decor. There are different trends in our modern era, with the most recent being green burial. Although clearly this is basically just going back to the ancient way of burying a body. Embalming bodies gained in popularity during the Civil War and has continued today, but environmentalists have realized that putting all those toxic chemicals into the ground isn't a good thing. On top of that, do we really need to be preserving bodies for years and years? With a green burial, a body isn't embalmed or put into a coffin, but rather it's wrapped in a cotton shroud and put either into a simple untreated box or directly into the ground.
Now on to some unique or odd burials.
One weird burial is just marked with a headstone that reads, "Lady in Red found on Egypt plantation, 1835 to 1969. That's a huge stretch of time there.
Okay.
It has a very strange backstory. Farmhands were digging on the Egypt plantation in Kruger, Mississippi, when their backhoe hit something about 3 feet deep in the ground and they heard a loud cracking sound. That cracking was glass shattering. When they pulled the dirt away, they found a coffin made from cast iron and glass that contained a woman dressed in a red velvet dress who also had square-toed boots and white gloves. The year was 1969, so the farmhands were perplexed by the period clothing because the corpse wasn't decomposed. It was later found that the coffin had been sealed with alcohol inside to preserve the body. Nobody was able to identify the woman, and historians estimated that she was born before the Civil War based on her clothing. She was reburied at Lexington, Mississippi's Oddfellows Cemetery.
Rufus E. Case wanted to be buried next to his grandchild, but he had an unusual request. He wanted to be buried seated in his favorite rocking chair. So, he was placed in his favorite rocking chair above ground next to that grandchild. And then a brick structure was built around Rufus and his grandchild's grave. And there he sat until 2000, when the grave was renovated because bricks had crumbled away, leaving behind some cracks that people could look through and see the remains of Rufus still sitting in the chair. This is a 3-tiered burial in the Natchez City Cemetery.
I've actually seen this in person, and it looks like how I would describe it as a cake that has 3 tiers to it. So that's the way it looks. So it's got a little one at the top, and then medium, and then large. Here's something you don't hear every day. Peg-legged rope walker. That just doesn't sound safe.
Sounds like it might be a little bit challenging.
In the Hebrew cemetery of Corsicana in Texas, there is a tombstone set flat in cement that reads, Rope Walker with no name. A newer headstone was placed at the head of the grave that has the death year of 1884. The story goes that this peg-legged tightrope walker fell from a rope that was stretched across one of the town's main streets. He had an iron stove strapped to his back at the time. This guy's crazy. He's got a peg leg and now he's got a stove strapped to his back. The rope walker didn't die right away. As he lay dying, he asked for a rabbi, which is how the community knew he was Jewish. He never revealed his name.
Of course, our favorite cemeteries are those with upright headstones in a garden-like setting. Those will be the focus of our Stones and Bones episodes, although the world is full of unique cemeteries we also want to share. Some definitions to familiarize yourself with as we begin this journey through stones and bones throughout the world are as follows.
There's ledger stone, and this is a horizontal grave marker that is flush to the ground and covers an entire grave plot.
Next, we have columbarium. Comes from the Latin word columba, meaning dove because they resemble dove houses. These are a room, building, or wall that has niches where cremains can be placed. These began during the Roman times.
A chest tomb. A chest tomb is an above-ground stone box with many opportunities for decorations. There are 5 sides here that can have symbolism and decor. Chest tombs inside churches typically have effigies atop them. The ones found out in the churchyard usually only have decorative stuff on the sides. There are several styles of chest tombs: Tudor, Stuart, Georgian, Greek, Gothic, and Egyptian. A distinctive early table chest tomb was for Richard Percival, who was a commander during the Crusades and died in 1202. A Stuart-era chest tomb from the mid-1600s features a skeleton holding an hourglass and an arrow on one side, and a palm frond and arrow on the other. The arrow is for death, hourglass for time, and the palm frond for victory over death.
Crypt. A crypt is a type of burial vault that comes from crypto, meaning hidden. These are generally found under churches, but sometimes under other buildings. These are stone-chambered, and whole families might be buried in one together. These are known as family crypts. A garden crypt can also be called a lawn crypt, and this is built into the ground, usually with no entrance. Something like an underground mausoleum.
And speaking of mausoleum, this is a Greek word that is inspired by the name of the ruler of Caria, Mausolus. His tomb was one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Mausoleums are freestanding buildings that can hold one or more bodies and can be built in a variety of sizes. Some are elaborate, like the Taj Mahal. A lot of people don't know, but that is actually a large mausoleum. And others are smaller burial vaults.
Every culture has their own way of dealing with their dead. Different eras have also brought their own techniques and observances. All of them are meant to give respect to the dead and to honor their lives. And this is just a little bit about the stones and bones when it comes to burying the dead.
Thanks so much for joining us on this very first Stones and Bones episode. I've been your host, Diane.
And this has been Kelly.
You take care now.
Bye-bye.
Stones and bones.
with the best known one from the Shang Dynasty for Lady Fu.
pronouncenames.com.
How?
Do we have the correct pronunciation of your
That was
name?
going to be funny to put in the bloopers. How?
How do you say H-A-O?
That was the
I
strangest
know.
pronunciation
And it's from
I've ever heard.
pronouncenames.com.
And I've ever
How?
heard on the computer. What in the world?